Hello everyone and welcome to Automation Recipes. My name is Vinicius Maidana, and on this video we're going to talk about the report builder feature of IBM RPA. We can use IBM RPA Studio to build report templates, which we can then use to generate reports using the information and data processed by the bots during the automation process. We can use many different kinds of data sources to generate these reports. And on this video, we'll take a look at how to actually build a report template using IBM RPA Studio. First off, here on the IBM RPA Studio Home tab, we're going to click on New and then Report File. This is the report wizard where IBM RPA assists us in creating the type of report we want to make. There are several report types like a table report, vertical report, label report, and we can even start a report from scratch using no templates at all. In this example, we will use a table report. Now we need to choose the data source for our report. Once again, there are several options like taking the data from a database, an Excel file, a JSON, so on and so forth. For this example, we will use a database as our data source. Next, we need to choose the database connection. We can use a previously established connection, but since we want to show every step here, let's create a new connection from scratch. In this screen, we need to insert the data for the database connection. We're going to try to connect to this IBM RPA database we have here. So here on server name, we'll use localhost/SQL, and on the database field, we will use IBM_RPA, then click Next. On this step, we can choose any tables from the database we connected to as our report data source. We could choose views, procedures, or even create a whole new query on this database to use as our data source. For this example, we will take the invoice table, then click Next. Now that we got the entire table as our data source, we can pick which columns of the table we actually want to use on our report. I'm going to select all columns, then remove some of the columns that I don't really need for the report. Here, we could group each column of the table into specific data field groups, but for now, we'll not really do that. We will use all data fields in one single default group. Here on the data member section, we don't really need to do anything, so let's just go ahead and click Next. And on this part, we can configure the layout of our report. We can configure our page similar to how we would in a productivity app, like the paper size, margins, orientation, etc. For this report, we'll use the A4 sheet format with the landscape orientation and 1/2 inch of margin on all sides. Next, we choose a color scheme for our report. Then we give a title to our report. Let's just name it Report by IBM RPA. Now we actually start building our report. At any moment, we can preview how our report looks by pressing the preview button on the upper right of the screen. Here in preview mode, we can see that our report is already displaying some data fetched from the data source we chose earlier. To resume editing our report, let's go back to designer mode by pressing the designer button on the upper right. Before we actually start editing stuff, let's understand how the layout of the report editor works. We can see there are several bands here on our report, and each band holds a part of our report. For instance, at the top band, we have our report title, which shows up at the very top of the page, like we just saw now when we previewed the report. Then we have two more bands in the middle of the report page, which are the header band and the detail band. The header band, as its name implies, holds the header for the data field shown in the report. In this case, we can see, for instance, the invoice number header, the invoice data header, among several others. All of these header titles are being taken straight from our data source. In other words, they are the column names from our database in this case. Right below in the detail band is the actual data values from each data field in our data source. This is where the actual values from each of these data fields is displayed on our report, and just like the headers, they are automatically taken straight from our data source, i.e., they are the values from each row in the database tables. And finally, we have the bottom band, which holds our report page footer. The header and detail bands generate several lines on our report page. As long as there is data to be fetched from our data source, the report builder will automatically add all those lines to our report page, even if multiple pages are needed to hold all the information from the data source. The report builder will create as many pages and as many lines necessary to display all the data requested from the data source. Going back to preview mode, we can see that we have 10 lines of data in our report, which means that the report builder is fetching 10 rows from the table from our database. So now let's start customizing our report. We can resize each band of our page just by clicking and dragging its margins. Let's enlarge our top band first. To the left of the screen, we have the toolbox, where we have all kinds of elements we can insert into the report page. We can insert images, graphs, text, more data fields, all sorts of things. Let's insert an image on the top band as the logo for the report. All we need to do is drag and drop the image element onto our report page. Next, we need to configure this image element to display the image we want. To configure the element, we need to left-click on the right pointing arrow at the top of the element to open its properties window. Then, on the image URL field, we click on the three dots to open the file manager so we can navigate on our storage and choose the image we want to be displayed here. Then we choose the image sizing. In this case, we use squeeze. Then we resize the image to fit the band as we desire. Now that we got a logo for our report, let's try adding a subband to the report header band. To add a subband, just right-click on a band's name, then choose the Add Subband option from the context menu. We could have also added an entire new band to the report page. The procedure is almost the same. All we need to do is choose the Add Band option instead. Now that we have a subband on our report header, let's try adding some graphs in it. Just like with the image, we drag and drop the graph element onto the report page, wherever we want it to be located at. As soon as we drop the graph element onto the report page, the Chart Designer window will pop up. This is where we can configure our graph however we see fit. We can see that by default, the graph is configured as a bar chart with some data from the data source already bound to it. Let's delete this binding so we can configure the graph from scratch. So, to choose what data field from our data source we want to bind to this chart, we need to navigate to the Data tab on the upper right of the Chart Designer window. Here, we can see the table we chose from the database as our data source. If we expand the invoice data source here, we can see all the data fields contained in it. That is, all the columns from the database table. To bind the data field to our chart, all we need to do is drag and drop it onto the appropriate chart data field on the bottom here. In this case, we will bind the description data field to the chart series, the invoice date to the argument, and the total USD to the value. Now let's start customizing our chart by changing its properties. We need to navigate to the Properties tab here and then choose the series we just generated. First, let's change the date type summary options here. Here we have the option of using a summary function to group all data from a given data source. For instance, here we will leave the measure unit option as day and the measure unit multiplier as 1. Then on summary function, we click on the three dots to open the summary function window. Choose the sum function and then choose the total USD data field from our data source. Basically, with these settings, our chart will sum up all the total values from each transaction on our data source by day. We could change these settings to group these values in many different ways. For instance, we could also sum up all values from the total USD data field by week, just changing the measure unit to 1 week and leaving the measure unit multiplier as 1. The possibilities for grouping data in different ways by changing the combination of settings here are incredibly vast, and I encourage you to play around with these settings to see what results you can achieve. Now we can resize the chart on our report page, then preview our report to see what the chart will look like on the actual report. As you can see here, the chart is grouping the total value of transactions from each different item by day, like we established. And we can resize and replace the chart on our report using designer mode. Then use preview mode to see what the report will look like as we see fit. Let's try adding another chart to practice some more. Just like before, let's first delete the default series. And now we'll click on this plus button here, right next to the series category. so we can choose what kind of chart we want to make. This time, let's try creating a pie chart. Once again, let's navigate to the Data tab to bind data to this chart. We'll use the invoice description as the argument and the invoice total USD as the value. Now let's navigate to the Properties tab and customize our chart. Let's start by customizing the pie chart's legend text pattern. By default, the legend to the top right of the chart will display the actual values in the chart. Here we'll add the argument as the chart's legend, which will change the legend from the values in the chart, that is, the percentages of each item, to the argument we choose for this chart. In this case, the description of each item. Keep in mind that the chart you see here on this window is for demonstrative purposes only. The actual data from the chart that you are creating is not displayed here. We'll only see the data once we finish setting up the chart, just like with the bar chart before. Also keep in mind that you can customize any chart at any time, even after you've finished inserting it onto the report page. For the qualitative summary function, we will use the same function we used for the bar chart we made before. Sum up all the values from the total USD data field. And last but not least, we'll change the labels in our pie chart, displaying them on the inside of the pie instead of the outside like it is now. Now, let's resize our new chart to make it fit the page better, then preview it to see what's going to look like on the actual report. As you can see here, both charts are presenting the same data, only in a different manner. The bar chart is displaying the total transaction values per day, while the pie chart is displaying the volume of the total value of each item's transactions. Okay, now that we got some charts in our report, let's try customizing how the data is displayed on the detail band here. Here, on the invoice date column, let's change how the date is displayed. First, we click on the desired detail cell, in this case the invoice date cell. Then, on the properties panel to the right, we'll click on the third icon, the data icon, to choose the data format we want. On the text format string field, we click on the three dots to open the format string editor window, where we can choose the format in which we want the data from the data source to be displayed, among a variety of format options. Here, we'll choose to display the date as day, month as the month abbreviation, and year. If you go to the preview mode now, you can see that the date on the second column of our report is now being displayed using the format we just chose. Next up, let's try creating a calculated field. A calculated field is, like the name implies, a data field that uses one or more data fields from our original data source and performs some kind of calculation with the data from those data fields. We can use calculated fields to display data on our report after handling said data however we need to. For instance, in this case, we are using a database as a data source, right? We could divide the values from one column from our database table by the value from another column from the table. The possibilities are almost endless, since we can treat the data from our data source however we want or however we need it to be displayed on the report. So we can do whatever we like with the data before we actually display it on the report. Alright, so to create a calculated field, let's first go to the View tab on our IBM RPA Studio. Then click on the Field List option. This will enable the field list on the right panel. Next, we click anywhere on the report page to have the data fields from the data source pop up on the panel. Now let's navigate to the Home tab on IBM RPA Studio. Then click on the Add Calculated Field button. After clicking, the Calculated Field Collection Editor window will appear. First, let's name our calculated field. We can name it however we like. We'll call this just as days. Next, we choose the data member, in this case the invoice table from our database. Then the data source will be the SQL connection we established with the database earlier. Then, the display name will name this total days. Now, we'll actually build the expression that will compose this calculated field. This is the expression editor, where we can build our calculated fields using a vast number of pre-built functions. There is an extremely large amount of functions and options here. We can make an entire course just about the expression editor. These expressions, by the way, are the same expressions available for building calculated fields on the IBM RPA dashboard. But all of that is a topic for another day. Here, let's focus only on the functions we'll use to build this calculated field, what they're for, and how we're using them. The first function we'll use is the substring function. We can search for functions by going to Functions, then using the search bar to find the function we want. You can insert a function into your calculated field by double-clicking on it. When you do, a tooltip with the function's description and its usage will pop up on the screen. In this case, the substring function will return a part of a larger text for us. The next function we'll use is the today function, which returns to us the current date, whatever day it is. We will use the current date returned by the today function and subtract the invoice date from the data source, which in practical terms will give us the number of days since the invoice has been issued. Then, using the substring function, we'll extract only the first two characters returned from this whole operation, which will give us only the number of days, with no month or year or anything else from the date. All we want are the days. This whole expression here may look complicated, but if you are acquainted with programming languages, you may have noticed some familiar structures here. And even if you're not a programmer, the logic for building these expressions can be understood after some practice. Like I mentioned before, the calculated field editor is very vast, so much so that it's enough for a whole session on it, so we can go in depth on how it works at another opportunity. Just keep in mind that this expression here will give us the total number of days passed since the invoice has been issued. And we can use that information on our report. So now, let's just click on OK and finish creating our calculated field. Now we can actually see our calculated field on the field list on the right panel here. To actually insert the calculated field we just created onto our report, we need to drag it to the cell we want it to show up on the report. Let's just rename the payment terms column to days, then drag the total days calculated field we created here. As we preview our report, we can see the total number of days that have passed since the invoices of each transaction here were issued. The last thing we'll do with our report before using it with a bot script is creating an input parameter. An input parameter can be used to import data from a bot script to the report. That way, when our automation process is being executed, we can input process information directly onto our report. So, to create a parameter, while editing a report template on the Studio's Home tab, we'll click on Add Parameter. Here on the Parameter Editor window, we can name a parameter and give it a description however we like. In this case, we'll just name the parameter as country and leave the description just the same. Next, we'll choose the type of data that is going to be stored in this parameter. This parameter is going to be a string parameter. In other words, it's going to store a text value. To finish setting up the parameter, we just click on OK. Now, to use the parameter we just created, we are going to add a label box onto our report page on the bottom band. Then we drag and drop the country parameter we've created from the field list to the inside of this label box. That way, whatever value this parameter stores will be displayed here. We can preview that by going to preview mode. Then on the left panel, we insert the value we want this parameter to receive, then click submit. This is how the parameter's value will be displayed on the report page. Now let's save a report template. To do that, all we need to do is click on the save button. By doing that, this screen will appear. This gives us the option to save the report as a separate file or as an asset to the bot script. In this case, we will save it as an asset to the script by choosing the second option. Then, we need to name the report asset. We'll leave the extension as it is. The .repx or .repx is the standard extension for IBM RPA report template files. Going to the bot script, we can see the invoice template here on the right panel as a script asset. To wrap things up here, we will use the export report command to export the report template we've created. We could also use the print report command to send a report to a printer during the bot's execution. That way, we could automate even the report's printing. To configure the export report command, first we need to choose the report asset we created earlier on the asset parameter. Then, we'll disable the automap option to manually map the report's parameters. By using automap, the bot will automatically map the report's parameters to script variables if they have the same name. In this case, we'll manually map the country parameter we created to a hard-coded value, namely Brazil. We will leave the report's file format as PDF, then give a title to the report and an alter that will be displayed in the report itself. Finally, we insert the path in which the report file will be saved in. Now all we have to do is run the bot and check if the report was correctly exported to the folder we assigned. And here's the report we just exported with the bot, with the title, parameter, and all other info from the database we've chosen as the data source the exact way we've configured. So this is a basic overview of the IBM RPA Report Builder feature, a step-by-step of making a basic report using this IBM RPA Studio feature. The Report Builder feature is extremely vast, and we could go on about plenty of other methods and elements that we could use to build our report template to customize it however we need it. But for now, this should get you started. I hope you learned something this session. I look forward to new sessions where we dive deeper into other features of IBM RPA and even dive deeper into the report feature as well using business cases in the future. So, thank you for your attention and have a good one.